The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. It is just about 11 o'clock, so we'll get started here in just a minute. I'd like to thank everybody for joining me today. Give a brief presentation here on some considerations for risk assessment in terms of your information security management system. My name is John Laffey. I'm the technical manager at PJR, and let's go ahead and get started. A few notes here to begin. All participants have been muted, but I do encourage you to use the question tab in the dashboard at the end of the presentation as time allows. I will try and answer as many questions as possible. Also, copies of today's presentation will be available for download typically by the end of the day. They should be up on our website. And a recording of this webinar will also be available for download at pjr.com. Quick overview of the topics today. We're going to look at establishing the context, approach, and criteria for risk management. Then we'll look at risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. And again, after that, I'll go ahead and answer any questions that you may have. All right, context, approach, and criteria. So the internal and external context of your organization and scope of your ISMS will be key drivers in determining what the criteria will be needed for risk evaluation, impact, and acceptance. For example, contractual or regulatory requirements applicable to your organization could have a large influence on what your risk acceptance criteria will or could be. The risk assessment process should be reflective of the industry sector and risk related to your organization, as well as the expectations of your stakeholders and the current threat landscape. There are many different information security risk management strategies and approaches. ISO 27001 does not prescribe that any particular one be used. The standard does require, however, that assessment be performed at planned intervals or when significant changes are proposed to occur. So you're free to choose from any of the myriad approaches to risk management that are out there, or one that you've developed yourself. Again, the standard doesn't specify what the risk acceptance criteria should be. However, it does require that it is established and maintained. Additionally, the standard also requires that risks associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information be identified. So the CIA triad there are going to be the main drivers as far as what we're concerned with when it comes to your information assets. ISO 27001 requires that, again, risks associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information within the scope of your ISMS be identified, which can be an overwhelming task, especially when no formal approach has been planned for guiding the process. The standard, again, does not require that a specific approach be used, but just for demonstrative purposes in this presentation, I will outline a commonly used method to assist you with this task. Again, this is in no way implying that this is the method that is most effective or one that you should use. It's just for demonstrative purposes. So in this process, the first step is to identify the assets that are within the scope of the ISMS, keeping in mind that assets are not just hardware and software, but anything of value to the organization. So for this example, let's assume that there are primary assets, which would be business processes and information, and supporting assets, which would include things like hardware, software, network, personnel, site, organizational structure, etc. By first identifying the primary assets, the critical business processes and/or information, and the scope of the ISMS, you can then identify the supporting assets, which could potentially affect the confidentiality, integrity, and/or availability of the primary asset. Identifying an asset owner for all identified assets, which is also a requirement of the standard, and should be the person most appropriate for being responsible and accountable for the asset. In many cases, the asset owner may be this person, but it's not required. It just should be someone who has the most ability to influence decisions made about protecting it. Identify threats to the primary and supporting assets identified in the previous step, keeping in mind that threats may be accidental or deliberate and of natural or human origin. To ensure a comprehensive list is created, as well as to limit the amount of time it's going to take to do all this, you may consider using generic threat types such as unauthorized access, physical damage, or technical failure. Then in situations where specific threats of a certain type warrant explicit identification, ensure that you do so. Factors that would influence if a specific threat be identified should include the criticality of the asset they are associated with, as well as the level of damage they could cause if realized. So if you have something that's of critical importance to your organization and that also may have a huge potential for damages if realized, in those cases it would be worth it to go ahead and kind of enumerate what those specific threats may be instead of just the larger generic blanket threats. Also, when determining threats, please consider soliciting input from as many resources as you are able to. These could include asset owners, users, related staff members, legal departments, legal bodies, physical and informational security specialists, etc. The idea being that the more complete threat listing you can generate, the more informed and protected you can be. Identify existing controls already in place or planned to be implemented. This step may be simply a review of existing documentation of implemented controls in place, or if this is the initial iteration of the assessment and treatment process, may be more involved. If no existing control documentation exists, you will need to check with the folks responsible for information security. These could be people like your information security officer, a building manager, an operations manager, all depending on your specific situation. But to get a comprehensive list of controls already in place, so that's the goal there. The primary objective of this step is to avoid wasting time and/or money by duplicating controls. After completing this, you should have a list of all existing or planned controls, as well as their implementation and usage status. Next, you'll want to identify the vulnerabilities related to the identified assets, which are weaknesses associated with assets or controls that can be exploited by one or more threats. There are many resources that can be used to assist with vulnerability identification, including lists of common threats and associated vulnerabilities. There's automated scanners. You can have penetration testing done, code review, etc. After performing this step, though, you should have a list of vulnerabilities in relation to your assets, threats, and existing controls. The standard requires that a risk owner is identified for all risks, and these owners need to have the accountability and authority to manage their identified risks. So once these risks are identified, you want to make sure that they're assigned to someone who can take ownership and who also has the authority and ability to ensure that any necessary mitigation is going to be implemented and carried out. So to summarize, the goal of the identification process is to have a complete list of information assets with their associated threats, vulnerabilities, and a listing of existing and planned controls as well as their status. By gathering this information, you'll be best prepared to perform your analysis. So the whole idea at this point is to have a pretty complete view of what these assets that you've identified, what they are, potential threats and vulnerabilities associated with them, as well as any existing controls that may or may not be mitigating them, which should allow you to be able to come up with a final risk analysis that will give you an idea of where those risks are at. Which brings us to risk analysis. Again, there are many methods of analysis that can be used, and the standard does not require a specific methodology to be employed. Continuing with our example method, the next step would be to identify the potential consequences that the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability may have on the assets identified. A consequence can be a loss of effectiveness, adverse operating conditions, loss of business, reputation, damages, etc. By taking the list of assets and associated threats and vulnerabilities, scenarios can be drawn up by describing a threat exploiting a vulnerability. These scenarios should include operational consequences in terms of investigation and repair time, time lost, opportunity lost, health and safety, financial cost, image, reputation, and goodwill. Depending on the approach adopted by your organization, a qualitative or quantitative risk analysis methodology may be in place. In short, a qualitative analysis approach will employ a more subjective rating system for potential consequences and likelihoods, such as low, medium, and high, while a quantitative approach will use numerical values for consequences and likelihood. Each approach has its merits and can be effective methods of risk analysis. And I can say in my experience, I've seen approaches on both ends of that spectrum there. And, you know, some folks will have what looks to be very simplistic. However, it's very effective for them because it's very clear, you know, what needs to be treated. Without spending too much time on that part of it. Whereas I've seen organizations with quantitative approaches that are so complex, they can't even explain to me exactly how they came up with their final risk scores. So what's important is that you find something that is going to be used consistently and will be effective for your organization in your specific situation. To determine the level of risk, the consequence and likelihood values are combined to assign a raw value typically. And at this point, you have your risks and levels of risk identified. You can evaluate and prioritize the treatment for them. ISO 27001 requires that organizations evaluate their risk by comparing the analysis results against the criteria for performing their risk assessments, as well as the acceptance criteria that they have determined appropriate for their ISMS. The last step in the assessment process is to use the information gathered during the previous steps to make informed decisions and take action. The standard requires that untreated risks that are beyond the established acceptable level of risks, they must be treated. Additionally, the risk must be prioritized for treatment. Additional considerations besides the established acceptable level of risk that may be used include the importance or criticality of the asset the risk is associated with, the degree of confidence in the risk assessment process, as well as any contractual, legal, or regulatory requirements. All right. Kind of flew through there, so we should have plenty of time to go ahead and take any questions you may have. So let me pull those up. All right. Bear with me here for just a moment. All right, and I'm struggling here. Sorry, folks, just a moment. All right, I can't see who the asker was because my window is a little squished right now, but there was a question if there will be a copy of the presentation uploaded to the Perry Johnson site. Yes, there will be. It's like, again, it should be up by the end of the day today. Additionally, it was asked is this risk presentation to ISO 27001 only? So this particular presentation was obviously through the lens of the requirements of ISO 27001. But I am also a ISO 9001 auditor, and I know that the idea of risk-based thinking has been introduced to ISO 9001. In terms of that, you know, there's definitely some parts of this that if you were so inclined, you could look at implementing a risk management strategy in an ISO 9001 based system, but I would not say that it would be required by any means to this level of formality or complexity by the requirements of ISO 9001, if that's what the question was speaking to. I hope that helps. Randy has asked the question, where might I find a copy of this presentation? Randy, if you, oh, sorry. If you go to our website, which I'm going to try and do here in the background, so I can tell you exactly where to look for it. So if you go to pjr.com and you click on the upcoming webinars link, if you scroll down on the right-hand side, there's a link that says previously recorded webinars, as well as a link for past webinar slides. So that's where you should be able to find both those items. My pleasure, Randy. Thanks for attending. Would you please include a generic risk analysis example showing 5 risks for 5 assets? How they are ranked and any mitigation measures associated with them. Thanks, Mark. Well, Mark, I don't know that I'd be able to come up with something like that right here on the spot, but I certainly will take that into consideration going forward. I try not to be too prescriptive in any information I give here, but I definitely think there could be some value in showing just a generic example of such. So I think I'll go ahead and get that added into the presentation going forward. I appreciate the input. Oh, I got you, Mark. Yeah, I'll see if I can get a couple slides added in there that'll show that for you. I think that would definitely be of value for everybody. All right, guys, I'm just gonna hang out here for a few more minutes, see if any more questions roll in. If not, again, I'd definitely like to thank all of you for coming and hope that you get to enjoy a nice holiday weekend here coming up. Question here again from Mark. Would this type of risk analysis also apply to ISO 14001? Mark, to be honest here, I'm not actually familiar with ISO 14001, so I don't know the requirements specifically of what that standard is looking for in terms of risk analysis. But typically, from what I've seen, all of these kind of things fall under risk management, and this kind of approach I've described here, I would imagine could be applied to risk related to environmental factors or other things that a standard may be looking at. Obviously, you wouldn't be looking at confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information assets necessarily, but you could swap that out with whatever the criteria may be. Well, Mark, I appreciate it. Thank you for coming as well. You also have a great day. Ivan, thank you. Appreciate your attendance. All right, everybody. I think that's going to do it. Again, I'd like to thank you all for coming and hope to see you at my next webinar here, which is actually going to cover the next part of this process, which is going to be risk treatment. So thank you again for coming and have a great weekend.